I got some nice emails from several people in Devon, in Exeter, who had said that they had already watched the video or listened to the video of last week. So you've seen the methodology, and I'm assuming that most of the people that are there present from Winnetka, either online or in the room, again have managed to catch up on last week's. But it is there available, and TJ will be putting this one up online in the next couple of days. And I've also already sent him the PDF of today's slides, because there's rather a lot to get through, and I shall be moving, warning, I shall be moving fairly rapidly. And there's a lot of information in the slides. So you will get an email circulation either from TJ or from me with the PDF. And so hopefully that will all help you. How are we doing? Do we have a rector?
Present. We do. He says you're good to go ahead and just get started. So I think we're set.
You're not going to say nice things about me this week just because I'm not there, obviously.
One-time deal.
One time. Hello, Matthew. It's good to hear you, even if I can't see you. Good morning, everybody. Well,
Morning.
I'm sure some of you have just had a wonderful service. And I don't know if Richard Clement is in the room, but Richard, there's a number of people from Exeter connected with Exeter Cathedral, and Richard Clement is the Director of Music at Christ Church Winnetka, and he's bringing his wonderful choir to sing in Exeter Cathedral as this year's visiting choir in the end of July into early August. So it's nice to have this connection. Right, let's get cracking then. So here's the summary. If you now fall asleep for the rest, or if I bore you for the next 45 minutes, I've already sent this round. We're going to be looking at Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God, which sounds like a challenge to the state, plus all of his teaching about non-violence, non-resistance, turning the other cheek, and so on. He lives out his teaching even to his own death, and the rest of the New Testament follows his direction. But my argument will be that since Constantine, the church has struggled to apply this to actually governing. And it's used non-Christian moral theology to develop, from the Greco-Roman basis, to develop a just war theory. And it's always struggled to know what to do about oppressive regimes. That was true particularly for Luther, which impacted significantly on the German church under the Nazis, and of course the Dutch Reformed Church in the Lutheran tradition under apartheid. So in the light of all of that, the question, as we're asking in all of these sessions, is can we actually follow Jesus in this area today? So I want to take you on a quick tour of the National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C. I've been there on many occasions. I've even had the privilege to preach in it on the anniversary of 9/11 on one year when my choir were on tour. And that was a great honor, huge barn of a place to preach in, and to be in that chapel that Bishop Miriam Buddy, the Bishop of Washington, spoke from the day after the inauguration was remarkable. However, very briefly, I want to just show you some of the chapel war memorial in the National Cathedral. It has a beautiful altar, and you can see in the bottom left here a picture of the suffering Christ, with a halo that is, on the one hand, looks a bit like a crown of thorns, but on the other hand is also looking like a radiance of light. All of those pointy things are swords, bayonets, and shrapnel from battlefields, which is quite a remarkable thing. And then you can see above, there's the crucified Christ there, but there's clearly a war landing scene going on around here. I want to draw your attention to this, the next window to it. We're going to look at it in a bit more detail, but just to see so you can get the geography. There's David and then Richard the Lionheart. There is the landing of the Pilgrims and the amphibious landings of World War II, clearly connected with the word landing. there was William Penn bringing liberation to the Native Americans there, and the US Army bringing liberation to Europe. So a real attempt to sort of connect through from New Testament times, from Jesus through history to today. So here is the central panel. I mean, some beautiful stained glass, I have to say. I was not expecting to find Richard the Lionheart in the windows of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., complete with the three lions, which I normally see on the England cricket jerseys. But there's King David playing his lyre, so he hasn't got a sword, at least in this occasion, though he's probably making up a very angry and warlike psalm at the time. And there's Richard the Lionheart, and as I say, below we see the landing of the Pilgrims, stand then underneath the amphibious landings in World War II, and then on the other side, William Penn bringing liberation to the Native Americans, and US troops bringing liberation to Europe. Then I found there's a window of the two Georges, and we've just had St. George's Day back in the UK. I don't know whether they celebrate it on the same date, April the 23rd, in the States. But it's interesting, we have George and the Dragon on the left-hand side, and George Washington on the right-hand side, complete with his sword. And you can just see down at the bottom, it says Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation of Slaves, and on the other side, Paul Revere. But let's have a look at what they look like. That's the bottom of Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation of the Slaves, and that is paralleled with the very famous picture of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. And Paul Revere is mentioned here, as you can see, complete with musket, and paralleled with the paratrooper landings. It's not just in America. I did a lot of the research on this in Trinity College, Melbourne, in their memorial chapel. And as well as St. George's Day, we've just had Anzac Day. That's the Australia and New Zealand, I can't remember what the A stands for, Auxiliary Corps or something. But anyway, it's all the Australian and New Zealand troops, particularly in the First World War, who came to the defence of the motherland. And they turned up on time, unlike some other people who were a couple of years late. But it's a huge day in Australia, Anzac Day, and they've just had it. My friends in Australia, it's a national holiday. There are parades and so on to commemorate it. And in the seminary of Trinity College, Melbourne, where I've had the privilege to teach over many years, this extraordinary brick block house is actually the chapel. And it was built by public subscription among the alumni in the immediate aftermath of World War I as a memorial chapel. And there are lots of plaques to students who lost their lives in the First World War, and then subsequently all the way through the Second World War and through to Vietnam and so on. And if you are standing with your back to the congregation facing east to the altar, you are looking up at this window on the far left-hand side, obviously with the crucified Jesus up above, but below is this remarkable, in other words, straight in your face, is this remarkable picture of Constantine, which you can see on the right-hand side here. Here's Constantine on his horse at the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. For those of you who don't know, Constantine was the first English Roman emperor. He was born in York. He became a Christian and led his troops to overthrow the powers in Rome. And on the way across the Milvian Bridge, he claimed to have this vision of seeing, and you can see it here, the Chi Rho, the Chi and the Rho, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, and heard a voice saying, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. And so here is the cross being used as a conquering symbol for the troops going into the battle, of course, which in fact resulted, of course, in the Roman Empire becoming Christian. And dotted throughout the chapel, there are these little shields with pro ecclesia, pro patria. Serving for the church is the same as serving for the fatherland. Pro ecclesia, pro patria. And on another occasion, I did a rectory swap with the rector of the Church of Our Saviour in San Gabriel. He got our deanery in Highgate. I got his wonderful house and swimming pool and his large Chevrolets and so on in San Gabriel, just outside Los Angeles. But I had to walk past this huge statue of George Patton on the way in. He was born in San Gabriel, grew up here, the family were all still there. There he is, hands on hips, with holding on to the ivory handles of his pistols. And the window in the church, guess what? Here we go again, George and the Dragon. Except, of course, as you can see, the dragon has got swastikas all over it. And here's George Patton in his Sherman tank. You can see the gun there. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can? Can you see my arrow where I'm pointing? Great. So yes. Here's George and his tank. There's the swastikas on the dragon, and all these names are the various towns that he liberated, and the various battles and all of his medals and so on around there. So this kind of very clear identification of the Georges, St. George, George Washington, George Patton, with things like the landing of the Pilgrim Fathers being paralleled with the amphibious landings, and I'm going to use the word in quotes, the liberation of the Native Americans with the liberation of Europe and so on. And this is, please, I'm not criticizing America on this. I could have done, and when I've done this at home, I can show you plenty of cathedrals and so on in England. But I just was interested to see this here in these places where I was working literally on this material, here in DC at the National Cathedral, in Los Angeles in the Church of Our Saviour, and in Australia. But talking of George Patton takes me back to this slide, which we looked at last week, because we talked about the fact that I'd done this big conference with Terry Jones and John Cleese, and I had Bible scholars across the world queuing up to want to take part. And one of the discussions was, why did you want to do a film called Jesus and Brian, or rather, Life of Brian? And the answer was that at the premiere of The Life of Brian, the premiere of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, one of the media journalists called out, what's the next film going to be? And at the same time as Holy Grail was being premiered in the next door cinema, George Patton Lust for Glory was being premiered. And Eric Idle quipped, oh, I don't know, how about Jesus Christ Lust for Glory? And that was just a typical sort of Patton, Eric Idle joke. He was always the nihilist and the most anti-Christian of the Pythons. And when Monty Python and the Holy Grail did very well, they took it seriously. Well, what about making another movie? And they all got together and everybody said, well, then why don't we do Eric Idle's idea of Jesus Lust for Glory? Especially the way the church has behaved over the last 2,000 years, and then we can really offend everybody. And they said at the conference that they went off and they read the Gospels. They even read the Gnostic Gospels. I was in a research seminar beaming out of Manchester on Thursday with Professor George Brooke, who is probably the leading expert in the UK on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and George was in the front row. And he called out, well, if you managed to read the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gnostic Gospels, you did a damn sight better than most of my students. But what they came to was that they all came back and all shared the same experience, that reading the Gospels, and indeed reading the non-canonical Gospels and Dead Sea Scrolls and so on, they came back and said, we can't make a movie called Jesus Christ Lust for Glory. Jesus is all right. We're actually really quite impressed with him as a great moral teacher, and they put him up there along with the great moral teachers of our human history, like Socrates or Buddha and Martin Luther King and so on. And they said, what we have to do is to make a picture about a failed Messiah, because they had realized that at that time in the first century, there were lots of people coming up and proclaiming themselves to be Messiah, and they would gather followers a lot. And if you know the famous scene where Brian is in the pit with Terry Jones, the guy on the left here who directed it. Terry Jones is wearing nothing but a very long beard because he's been a silent hermit for years, and he's just broken his silence. And Brian is saying, "No, I'm not the Messiah." John Cleese says, "I say you are, Lord. I should know. I've followed enough of them." And what they wanted to do was their target was the way people follow messiahs, and in particular, and John was talking about this both at the time when Brian came out in 1979, and Michael Palin got very angry with the Bishop of Southwark at the time, about the way in which the people who were following a Messiah who preached peace, yet they were constantly fighting, not just other people, but also fighting one another. And in the life of Brian, if you know, the movement quickly splits because Brian drops his gourd, and he also drops the sandal, and they split into two groups, one who follow the gourd and one who follow the sandal. So the point of the joke was the way in which the followers of Jesus, A, don't follow his teaching, and B, they don't just fight others, they fight even among themselves. And I put this up because Matthew told me how much he really likes this picture of me and John Cleese trying to really going at it hammer and tongs, as you can see in our hand gestures, are arguing about it. And they said, that they really respected the New Testament as a book of ethical teaching. What was really interesting was when we discussed the Pattern Lust for Glory story, I said I'd read in their diaries it took place in Leicester Square. John Cleese said he thought it had happened in Amsterdam. Terry Jones said he didn't ever remember being in Amsterdam. And I said, well, if you remember being in Amsterdam in the 70s, you probably weren't there, given all the substances that people were consuming in Amsterdam. And then John said, well, Eric Idle thinks it happened in Calgary. And I pointed out that there were four of them talking about an historical event, which we all agree somebody said this to Eric Idle, he quipped back, Jesus Christ, lust for glory. But they couldn't agree, among the four of them, where it had happened or exactly when it had happened about 30 years previously. And of course, we have the four Gospels recording what I believe to be historical events and actual words of Jesus that are just as historical as the I don't know how about pattern lust for glory that Eric Idle came up with. But eyewitnesses don't necessarily agree on the sorts of details of like where and when. And I find that really helpful with things like the fact that the temple incident occurs in different places in John's Gospel at the start and in the other Gospels at the end. And those of us who did my John course will remember us discussing that. But I have to say there are problems with this view of Jesus and this view of the Bible. And I pointed this out last week by saying that both of these things, that Jesus is a great moral teacher and that the Bible is a book of ethics, are actually not true. They are what I call genre mistakes, and I illustrated that by saying I like the restaurant at the end of the universe, and some of the group smiled immediately, others looked confused because they thought I was talking about a restaurant, where in fact I was talking about this book by Douglas Adams, the second book in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy. And Jesus is not primarily a moral teacher like Socrates or Buddha. He's a preacher, a teacher, a prophet in the Old Testament prophetic tradition. And the way he behaves and the way he speaks is very different from moral teachers. And nor is the New Testament a book of ethics. I mean, it's a library and it contains some 27 books. And in fact, it doesn't contain any of the books there that were composed or written in a recognizable ethical genre within ancient literature. And the same is true of the Old Testament. None of there are prophetic books, there are narrative books about the history of Israel, there are the writings of the Psalms and so on. None of them are ethics. That doesn't mean that there isn't ethics in Jesus' teaching or in the Bible, but they're not the primary purpose. So the question we were looking at last week was, what is he and what is the Bible? And just to refresh this slide, and my extra friends will be familiar with that, my argument is that I did my PhD on what are the Gospels to show that they're the same as ancient lives and must therefore be interpreted in a similar way, and that Greco-Roman biography is very different from modern examples, and they provide a portrait through the deeds and words of a person with an extended account of the person's death. And then in 2013, and we put this up last week in memory of Pope Francis, I was awarded the Ratzinger Prize, like Vatican's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, by Pope Francis in 2013. And the citation was that I had established the indissoluble connection of Jesus and the Gospels. In other words, I had proved that the Gospels were about Jesus, which was a problem that the previous Pope Benedict had found that German scholarship had pushed the figure of Jesus into the mist. And here I am giving a copy to Pope Francis of my little book on the four Gospels, one Jesus, which I said last week was my attempt to answer the so what question. What difference did that big book on what are the Gospels make to how we read the Gospels today? And I did that through the four images of the lion, ox, eagle, and human face that we get in the cherubim in Ezekiel 1 and the four living creatures around the throne in Revelation 4, which by about 150 to 180 were being applied to the Gospels, as Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon writes in his book Against the Heresies. And so I got myself interested into the four images in Celtic art and how I could use these to illustrate the story of Jesus. And you can tell from my interest in stained glass windows today how I'm interested in particularly in the non-literary cultures of the ancient world and the medieval world, how stained glass was a way of teaching. And as we have moved out of a book culture into an online culture, we are increasingly today in a pictorial kind of culture again. And therefore, as Matthew knows, from when I first came here in 2009 and started working on this book, the first half was called Imitating Jesus, which was an attempt to take the implications of genre for seriously. If the New Testament is not a book of ethics, what are the ethics in Jesus, Paul, each of the four evangelists, the rest of the New Testament, and so on? And that's the big book that I brought several copies, and I think they've all gone, but you can get them from my publisher or from Amazon. And the second part I've been working on for the last 15 years was going to be called Following Jesus, and the subtitle Money, Sex, Power, Violence, Meaning of Life. And it was Matthew, among others, who came up with the idea of swapping the title around and calling it Money, Sex, Power, Violence, the Meaning of Life. And then for Winnetka, he came up with this very helpful subtitle, Can We Actually Follow Jesus Today? And what I'm trying to do is to take Jesus seriously, not as a moral teacher, but as a preacher or prophet of what we call restoration eschatology. The idea, eschatology is the study of the eschaton, the end of all things, and it was the idea that at the end, God will restore Israel. So he's not just another moral teacher, and that means that any of his ethical instruction or moral teaching cannot be abstracted from his overall primary concern to preach the kingdom of God. And this is one of the points I was trying to make to John Cleese and Terry Jones. You can't just say Jesus is a moral teacher and we like his moral teaching and say, but he was completely deluded about his ideas about himself. The other difference is that Jesus is clearly looking for a response from his hearers as I was in following him, whereas moral teachers just want to be obeyed. And therefore it also takes the Gospels seriously as ancient biography. Again, people using the New Testament for ethics just look at Jesus' ethical teaching, the Sermon on the Mount or whatever. We're ignoring the narrative, what is his practice. So we have to have the commands and the narrative, and it's there in Acts chapter 1 where Luke says, in my first book I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach, and therefore we have to look at words and deeds and a narrative approach, not just looking at ethical rules. And this is an opportunity allowing us to also talk about, to include those with whom we disagree, which I'm just labeling with the phrase the other. It's always difficult to get the right word for that. And we also pointed out last week that despite all my work on ethics in King's College London over 25 years, as I walked backwards and forwards across Waterloo Bridge over the Thames, I never met a Roman legionary who asked me to carry his pack an extra mile. There's a clear command from Jesus about what I should do if I did do that, but it never happened. Equally, throughout the New Testament, there's all these stuff about the difficulty of meat being offered to idols, but it never happened to me when I went to the supermarket back home, or indeed to the supermarkets here in America. There's all sorts of helpful labeling about calories and sources of stuff, but it never says NB, this was been sacrificed in a temple. And so I used the image last week of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco as how do we bridge the gap between the first century and their concerns, like carrying a legionary's pack or idol food, with our topics, because I was trying to work with our War Department on nuclear war, with our Ethics Department on issues to do with same-sex relations, with our medical people on abortion, in vitro fertilization, embryo research, turning off machines, and with our business school on finance. And if I went to the New Testament and looked up all those topics, it didn't have anything to say about them. But I didn't want to say the Bible doesn't have anything to say. And we also raised the issue that you can sometimes get on a foggy day in San Francisco, which is half the time, when you can't see either side of the bridge. And the idea that the Bible is so rooted in its culture, and we're rooted in our culture, we cannot communicate with one another. And I said that cultural relativism was itself culturally relative, and I quipped that as somebody who was a student in Oxford in the 1970s, I couldn't possibly understand what a bunch of dons in some inferior university called Cambridge had been putting together in the 1960s. Of course, that's nonsense. And the fact that they wrote a book in the 1960s, which is still a crucial book now, it shows that you can bridge across the cultures. You just have to allow for the fact that there may be very strange people who were hanging around in the 60s and in a place called Cambridge, and we have to make allowances for that when we try to read it in today's thing. So we cannot ask 21st century questions of a first century text. The New Testament does not have anything to say about nuclear war or the invasion of Ukraine or anything like that. And what I decided was that what bridges the gap is that all peoples and all cultures throughout space and time, down through history and across the globe, have raised taboos, ethics, mores about the issues of things like money, sexuality, power, violence, the meaning or value of human life. And they were concerned about those issues, and we're concerned about those issues. And that's where we find our common humanity, is the fact that the human beings seem to feel the need to put ethical stuff around these very crucial topics, that somehow they are topics that get us into touch with our essential humanity and indeed our essential life in the cosmos. And it gets us over the cultural gap, and it gets us over the contingency of issues. It doesn't have anything to say about international finance or big business bonuses, but there are 200 verses that I've collected with all the words that include money, poverty, wealth, copper, silver, gold, purse, belt, and so on. It doesn't have anything to say about nuclear war and so on, but it has about another 200 verses which do talk about war and violence and power and so on. And so over these next 4 weeks, having looked at this method, I raised the question through the stained glass windows of the link between war and violence and in our places of worship. So Richard Hayes used this fourfold method, the descriptive task, the full exegesis. Somebody asked me last week what exegesis means. It just simply means leading out. Ex and hegesis is leading out. So what you do is you lead out of the text its relevance for today. What a lot of people do is eisegesis, which is where you read our ideas into the text and then bounce them back at us with the added agreement that God agrees with me, which is always helpful. The second was the synthetic task. How do we bring it together? And he used the focal images of community, cross, and new creation. the hermeneutic task, which is not a professor in Bonn, but just means the interpretive task, Hermes being the go-between, to cross the bridge, and the pragmatic task, how do we bring it to today? And this is in his great book, The Moral Vision of the New Testament. And his point about the exegesis of the relevant texts, I said, is how do you decide which are the, in quotes, relevant texts? So Richard, for instance, in his chapter on violence, has one key passage, and he interprets all the others in the light of that, to which my answer is, are we hearing the New Testament, or are we hearing Richard Hayes's take on the New Testament? And that's the problem with some of the topics. You have a lot of material. On many other topics, there's not many texts, or even none. And practically nothing about same-sex issues, certainly nothing on abortion, certainly nothing on stem cell research or nuclear war. And one of the things he tends to do at that point is say, oh, well, the New Testament will have agreed with the Old Testament, so let me look and see what the Old Testament says about some of those topics. But again, there's still nothing on stem cell research or nuclear war. So what I've been doing is trawling a drag net, like a fishing boat, catching all the verses with all that human moral experience. And by not looking for 21st century questions, but by looking for the topics of money, sexuality, power, I've gathered groups of about 200 texts. And I start with Jesus. Richard Hayes starts with Paul and gets 200 pages through his book before he says, well, what about Jesus? And I think we really ought to start with the guy who sets the whole thing off. And what we use here is what we call the triple tradition. And that is the verses and so on which appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, hence triple, sometimes with slight variations. But it means we have three witnesses to that text. But I'm not just looking at his teaching, I'm looking at his deeds as well as his words, the narrative, and not just the teaching. So I'm looking for stories and examples as well. So the background to Jesus and his teaching on this topic may be different from ours, but it still has a very strong military background. The context is the Roman occupation. Now, please don't think of the Roman Empire and its occupation as being like, say, the Nazis in France. Rome was a much more open kind of, it wasn't terribly interested in the actual countries and so on. Often you see Jesus movies with legionaries all over Nazareth. Most people in Galilee would never see a Roman legionary. The Roman legionaries were actually out on the major legionary fortresses on the edge of the empire, down the barrier between the ancient Mediterranean countries and the Eastern empires, what we would now call Syria, Iran, and Iraq. There were some auxiliaries around the place, but most of the time, the Romans were quite happy to let the local kings or powerful people govern internally, provided that they left external policy to Rome and provided they paid tribute. What had happened in Pompey the Great in 63 BC did his great settlement of the East, where he took the legions all the way through what we would call Turkey, Israel, Palestine, Syria, Egypt, and so on, settled it all down, put the edge of what would become the Roman Empire in place, and let Herod the Great in particular run the country. He made such a mess of it that in the end, if the client kings can't keep the thing on the road, Rome will do direct rule. So Judea, the area around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, became a Roman province directly under the emperor, with a Roman procurator, i.e. He was curating it pro on behalf of the emperor, but the various bits of Nazareth and Galilee and so on were still in the territories left to Herod's sons. And that meant that there were lots of different Jewish groups in Jesus' day who had different responses. How do we handle this situation? The chief priests and the Sadducees were cooperating. Now, again, that doesn't mean they're like, say, Vichy France or something, but basically they were running the temple, And the Romans were perfectly happy for them to run the temple. They respected it. They kept legionary insignia and so on away from the temple. They permitted sacrifice to take place. And of course, they levied a percentage tariff, I think would be the word that somebody here would use, on what went on in the temple. So they were cooperating. The Pharisees, who appear a lot through the Gospels, retreated more into the chief priests and Sadducees are like, if you like, the Catholics. As long as we've got the cathedrals going and we can do our services, we're okay. The Pharisees are your Protestants, your evangelicals doing Bible study. They retreated into personal piety, the study of the scriptural scrolls and so on, and were very concerned about individual purity rather than animal sacrifice. Then there were the Essenes, who were like the monks, who said, actually, the group of the priests and Sadducees are all evil and cooperating with this empire. So they withdrew into communities in the desert, in Qumran and the Essenes. And of course, that is actually how a lot of Christians reacted to Pilate becoming, to Constantine becoming Roman emperor, that they again withdrew into the desert. But there was also a group that wanted to do armed resistance, which drew on the Holy War tradition in the Old Testament. They were called zealots because of their zeal for the Lord. Or sometimes they use the Latin word sicarii. Now, sicarion is a dagger, and a sicarius is a dagger carrier. And they were basically guerrillas who would sidle up to a Roman soldier, or probably more likely an auxiliary, in a back alley in the night, ask him for the time or something, and while he was distracted, stick the dagger in his chest and move on. So there's a whole range of options about how to respond to the Roman Empire and to its army there. And in Jesus' words and teaching, looking at Mark and the triple tradition, the one thing, I don't know any New Testament scholar who doesn't think that the heart of Jesus' teaching was the so-called kingdom of God. Now, the problem with kingdom is it comes with all sorts of baggage, not least it's a masculine thing, king, whereas basileia in Greek and malkut in Hebrew are feminine abstract nouns. So you would be better off talking, if you have to use king words, kingship, or preferably rule. It's also what the Roman Empire would have been called, the basileia of Caesar, who was the basileus. Didn't mean it was the kingdom of King Augustus, but it was the Roman Empire. And so Jesus is constantly banging on about the empire of God. And it's interesting that Warren Carter, New Zealand, Australian, great biblical scholar, always translates it in Matthew's commentary on Matthew as the empire of the heavens. And I think that's a really interesting idea because, of course, it really says that when Jesus was speaking about the basileia of God, the kingdom of God, he was talking about a different empire, a different emperor. And it's impossible that language would not have been heard in political terms in his own day. And there's all the parables about where he tries to show how different the empire of God is from the empire of Rome or human empires. It grows secretly like seeds in Mark chapter 4 or the parables in Matthew 13 and so on. What's interesting is the disciples, of course, signed up, and they're the ones who are hearing all of this, and they are, although Jesus keeps telling them that he's going to Jerusalem to suffer, James and John, two of his inner group of three, come to him in Mark 10 and say, Lord, we've got a request to make. Can we have the seats of honor, your right hand and left hand, when you come in your empire? And Jesus had to say, no, you can't. You can share my throne, which is death. And that is rather an embarrassing story, which Luke omits and Matthew makes their mother say. But James and John also are the ones who wanted to call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans in Luke chapter 9. And then there's the famous story about render to Caesar, which is Caesar's, to God the things that are God's, gives us the idea of two spheres. And then you can see it here in this picture. Actually, what's wrong in that picture is that Jesus is handling the coin. He doesn't have a coin. He asks them to show the coin because it would have been against the Torah to bring a Roman coin into the temple precincts because it had on it a graven image, which is against one of the Ten Commandments, and an inscription that said about the emperor being the Son of God. And so when Jesus says, okay, show me a coin, they get one out of their pocket. And he says, what the hell are you doing having that in the temple? And the Greek word there is give back, don't have it. You shouldn't have this even in the temple. But it's interesting how the story is represented in that artwork as that Jesus is quite happily handling this blasphemous coinage. Jesus refuses earthly political power when it's offered to him by the devil in the temptations. He praises a centurion who doesn't say that I have authority. He says I'm under authority, and he obeys a higher authority. In other words, the centurion obeys his senior officer, who obeys his senior officer, who obeys the emperor, and that's why he's obeyed. And the centurion recognizes that Jesus is under a higher power. In the feeding of the 5,000, when the crowds want to turn and make him king, he runs away and hides. The whole point of the entry into Jerusalem in John chapter 12 and in the others, of Jesus coming in on a donkey, not like Pilate coming in on a charger. I was in discussion with Jeremy Clarkson and Top Gear back in the days when they wanted to do something on WWJD, what would Jesus drive? And Clarkson was arguing that Jesus would drive a Hummer, which is like the civilian equivalent of an American tank, and I said no, he came in on a Colt, which is a Mitsubishi little car. He's challenging kingly ideas. And even the temple incident, which we've spent in our John group talking about, was not really an act of rebellion. And I find it interesting in this picture, all the various famous pictures of the old masters, Goya and everything. Here's Jesus using a whip on people, whereas the text actually says it's just simply a rope, which he is using to herd the cattle. He doesn't actually use a whip on people. But we go on reading these texts through our preoccupation with violence. And what Jesus does is to weep over Jerusalem for its lack of peace and not realizing what was coming. And of course, he then follows his teaching through to the end. He offers no resistance to his arrest. Pilate declares him to be innocent several times in John, tries not to crucify him. He's also described as innocent by Pilate in Luke, and by the centurion at the foot of the cross in Luke's account. Doesn't say he's the Son of God, says he was innocent. He dies without resistance. In other words, he lives out his own teaching, follows his teaching even to suffering and death. Interestingly, though, however, he did include zealots. He had a whole group of mixed disciples. He had, and we'll come to him in the money session, Matthew, who was a tax collector, was alongside Simon, who was called the Zealot. And it would be obvious that those are the zealots who were looking forward for the empire of God would sign up to work with Jesus. And we don't know what Judas Iscariot means. It looks like the nearest thing in Hebrew Aramaic is Judas from the city of Sychar. But it may well be Judas the Sicarius, Judas the dagger carrier. And if he was a dagger carrier, a zealot, this may give us some background as to why he hands Jesus over to the authorities when he realizes that Jesus isn't about to start a revolution. And so what I do in my second stage was to say, we put all the results together, put them on a graph, and see if we can get the best line fit, looking at the idea here of the Milky Way in the night sky, the way we can see the white line. But we can see stars that are not on the line, obviously. And statisticians call these oops scores. What do you do with something that's off the line? They need to get out a bit more because they think this is very funny, because it stands for out of preference scores. It's something that makes you say oops. And behind a lot of my work is this sentence from the French-Canadian Jesuit Guillemet. Jesus does not give us directives. That's what moral teachers do, commands. He gives a direction. And so his direction in his words are the command is to obey the state. If the state contradicts God, then non-violent resistance is to be taken, even if it means going to your death. And that's the unanimous witness of the text to non-violence. And in his own deeds, he's constantly doing forgiveness and reconciliation because of God's action in Jesus to forgive and reconcile us. Moving on to the canonical stage, how do we fit the rest of the New Testament together? I'm not going to be able to have time to talk about all of these verses. They will be on the sheet that are sent around. But he rejects the political kingdoms and the temptations in Luke and Matthew. He talks about non-violence and the love of enemies in Luke and Matthew. He has the golden rule about not doing to others what you don't want them to do to you. And in Matthew, he says this is how to fulfill the law and the prophets. So that's the triple tradition, the double tradition of the stuff that's in Luke and Matthew. In the single traditions, if we look at Matthew, he has a whole section in the Sermon on the Mount of what we call the antitheses. You have heard it said, but I say. You have heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Matthew is the one who tells us to carry the legionary's pack, which is unique to Matthew. Matthew alone tells us that the golden rule fulfills the prophets. And Matthew has a saying which makes me go, oops, think not that I have come to bring peace, I've come to bring a sword. Hang on, Jesus is telling us he's bringing in a sword. If we look at a similar saying in Luke's gospel, it says, think not that I've come to bring peace, but I've come to bring division. And therefore, Jesus isn't bringing a real sword, but is using it in terms of I'm making a cut, a division. And so that's our oops score, which looks to be off the line, i.e. Jesus having a sword. And by looking at it carefully, it comes back on the line. And when he's asked about, are you paying the temple tax? He basically says, oh, for goodness sake, go fish. And tells Peter to pull a fish out, and it has the idolatrous Tyrian silver coin in its mouth, which is the thing for the temple tax. In Matthew, uniquely, he has Jesus saying to Peter that those who live by the sword will die by the sword, and tells Peter to put his sword away in Gethsemane, and says he could call legions of angels to help if he wanted to. And there's a similar rebuke in John. There's a lot of material in Matthew about forgiveness, the unforgiving servant, the Lord's Prayer, and the consequences of the failure to forgive. If we look at the unique material in Luke, again, we have the retaliation and love of enemies that he shares with Matthew. But Luke is the one who tells us about Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot. And Luke has a whole section at the Last Supper where authority and servanthood, where Jesus talks about, I am among you as one who serves. That the Gentiles want people lording it about, but he is among you as one who serves. But nonetheless, James and John still want to rain down fire on cities that reject them. And Luke has his own oops moment, that in the Last Supper, he says things are going to get so bad that people are going to want to sell a cloak and buy a sword. And you can just hear the disciples looking at one and saying, hang on, I didn't think the master was keen on swords. Two of them have got swords, or more likely daggers, in their robes, which they pull out and put on the table. And look, Lord, we've got 2 swords. And the text then says, that's enough, hikanos esti. And in most translations, that's how it gets translated. Well, that is it. If Jesus wouldn't have thought that 2 swords will be enough to deal with the detachment of temple police and possibly some Roman auxiliaries that were coming to meet him in Gethsemane, it's much more likely to be the Jewish idea of enough already. That's enough of that kind of talk. And this is where this method helps, because initially this question about the 2 swords looks like an oops score off the line. But actually, when we look at it more carefully, it's Jesus putting his head in his hands and saying, oh, good Lord, enough of that kind of chat. Only in Luke do we have the healing of the slave's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane. We've talked about Luke 22 just now. I am among you as the one who serves. There is the unique charge in Luke that Jesus taught against paying taxes, where we can see how Jesus was opposed to handling money with idolatrous images on it. And Luke is innocent, according to Pilate and the centurion. And it's interesting that the Lucan Passion story begins with Jesus praying, Father, forgive, they don't know what they're doing. A verse which, interestingly, does not occur in certain early Christian manuscripts. because it's almost as though certain scribes just couldn't cope with the idea that Jesus, as he was being nailed to the cross, well, the master couldn't possibly have asked for forgiveness for these bastards, could he? So they cut that verse out. John, we've talked about the whip in the temple being used as a rope on animals, his rebuke to Peter in the garden. The big debate with Pilate is just like the debate with the Roman soldier, the centurion. Pilate says, I've got the authority to have you executed, and Jesus says, no, your authority comes from above. And Pilate obviously thinks they means from the emperor. But Jesus is playing on the idea that actually ultimately Pilate's authority comes from God. And he says that my kingdom, my empire, is not of this world. That Jesus' power is also from above, i.e. God. And John's attitude to the world is very mixed. And I preached last Wednesday on John 3:16, God so loved the world, to make it clear how much God loves the world. And I'll be putting that up online in a few days' time. When we turn to the book of Acts, if you probably had the Acts reading this morning in church, that we must obey God, not the state, a verse that Desmond Tutu used all the time when P.W. Botha brought him in for Bible study and said, it says here you should obey us. And he says, no, we must obey God, not the state. And throughout the book of Acts, the early church is accused of being against Caesar and for another king, whereas the Roman authorities say, no, this is about an internal Jewish dispute, and that protects the Christians, and they respect Paul as a citizen, even apologize to him after they've whipped him. And like Jesus, the authorities are saying that they're innocent. But we also, of course, have the first martyrdom, where Stephen follows Jesus' example, even to being martyred. And if we look at Paul's teaching, we have Romans chapter 5, how God treated enemies. Romans 12, very interesting, one of the few places where Paul is quoting texts that look very similar to texts in the Gospels and the Sermon on the Mount. He often uses military imagery for discipleship, but in Galatians 3:28, where he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, that applies against all forms of nationalism and racism. And he's also very clear when he's writing to the Roman colony of Philippi that our politeuma, our political citizenship, is in heaven, not in an earthly way. So Jesus and Paul followed Jesus Christ's example, even to self-sacrificial death, used that for how God treated enemies, and there's Paul's own example of suffering. And just to show you, this same message goes all the way through Hebrews, James 1, Peter 1, John, Revelation, and so on. You can follow the same thing through the rest of the New Testament. If we look at how we look at the different types of subgenres and so on, I showed you last week the example of apartheid, and we have this list of looking for rules, principles, examples, or the worldview. So in rule-based, we have direct commands in Matthew 5 that go against the Old Testament commands. The Old Testament commanded holy war. Jesus says, love your enemies. There is the command to obey the state in Romans 13, and examples of how people have obeyed or disobeyed that. I've already referred to Desmond Tutu. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose martyrdom we commemorated a few weeks ago, after, 80 years, because Bonhoeffer was part of the plot to try to assassinate Hitler. On the other hand, Martin Luther King preached non-violence and ended up being assassinated himself. So they both followed Jesus to death and martyrdom. In terms of principles and values, the clear principle is to take up the cross and deny yourself and to live in harmony with others. In terms of narrative examples, we have Jesus' suffering, Stephen's death, the entry into Jerusalem, and the temple incident, all of which are examples of peaceful and in non-violent resistance. And if we look through the four or five main theological doctrines, the creation tells us that it's God's world. It doesn't belong to any government. We recognizes that there is sin and violence in a fallen world. But in the incarnation, God accepts violence even against himself and from the state. But the whole point about resurrection, and we're in Eastertide, is that evil cannot triumph over God. And at the end of all things, we will have the ultimate revelation of who's in control. So then we bring it to all that. So even if the New Testament is not a book of ethics, I think I've showed you there's a huge amount of ethical material there. The question is, how do we apply that to our practical questions today that the New Testament doesn't handle? And my guiding star there, as I said last week, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, in South Africa, bringing people, different blacks and whites, coloureds, Afrikaners, and freedom fighters or terrorists and so on together. And so this is where we have to get an inclusive community, including people we disagree with, and the voices of those who will be most affected. Don't be like the Afrikaners or the House of Bishops in the is that if you just have a group of white male old men, Afrikaners or bishops, they won't let other people into their club. You have to have a diverse group. And we handle this looking at the direction of travel as Guillemette, and to take up the cross. Now that gives us some content, but doesn't answer all the questions. And I have to say that since Constantine, of course, the church has not followed Jesus' ethic or the ethic of the New Testament. So how do we form this inclusive community and listen to the so-called outsiders? I know that Winnetka is doing it. And it is in that context that you can then say, is war or violence ever justified from the New Testament? Can we still say pro ecclesia, pro patria? What about violence against oppression? Are you allowed to use violence in self-defense or only in the defense of others? And what about the act of threatening violence, i.e. mutually assured destruction? The notion of nuclear weapons being used as peacemakers. What is the relationship of these New Testament texts to the long Christian tradition of the just war theory, which they got from Greco-Roman moral philosophy, not from the Bible? And then there's the doctrine of preemptive defense, for instance, the invasion of Iraq, or what Israel has been doing in Gaza. And how does this all apply in a nuclear age of biological or chemical weapons and the so-called war on terror? And even if you legitimize through just war theory says that non-discriminating weapons like landmines or nuclear weapons cannot be used because they don't discriminate between combatants and not combatants. And we have to grapple with the issue about how governments use Romans 13 under a Hitler or apartheid I've referred to. And the comparison of, say, Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King, or the ANC and Desmond Tutu. There's also violence economics, economic sanctions. Economic sanctions clearly helped to bring about liberation in South Africa. And I'm surprised there isn't more talk about the way in which China controls about nearly half of America's debt today. There's a tradition of UN intervention to try to stop genocide in Serbia, Kosovo, Rwanda. Congo's a real problem at the moment. And what about what's going on in Palestine and Gaza and Ukraine and so on? So, in conclusion, does this fourfold method provide us with some ethical material to work with, despite the fact that Jesus is not a moral teacher, the New Testament is not an ethical book, but it helps us to grapple with it? And how do we form inclusive communities of biblical interpretation in real life churches and congregations to do this comprehensively and allow for the voice of those we disagree to be heard? The summary is that Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God is a challenge to the state, with clear teaching about non-violence, non-resistance, which he lives out even to his suffering and death. Luke shows how the church tries to handle the state in Acts, and the Gospels and Paul reflect Jesus' teaching. They are following the direction of travel, which reaches its peak in the theme of martyrdom in the book of Revelation. In terms of the four subgenres, we have the direct commands to non-violence, the principles of self-sacrifice, and the way of the cross. We have examples to follow, like Jesus and Paul and Stephen's suffering, and an overall biblical worldview of God entering into our world and accepting human violence and the power of the state, and even to letting it kill his son, but always rising above it. And ever since Constantine had that vision of in this sign conquer, the church has struggled to know how to apply this to using non-government run governments, either through non-Christian moral theology, the just war theory, and the development of the so-called two kingdoms. Augustine had the city of God and the city of Babylon, and Luther picked up that idea that Jesus' teaching is in the personal sphere, can't be applied to governments and armies and so on, which gives us the constant problem about how to react either to the Nazis or to apartheid. What do we do with oppressive regimes? Is Jesus' teaching just simply something for the personal sphere? And I praised you at Winnetka for having this session, and I think you had your first session yesterday, about trying to get a group together where you listen to people of opposing views. That is precisely the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And yes, of course, here's the word from our sponsors. You cleaned out and bought half of my books last week. There are the last few of them available on the book table, and Gary's in charge of that. Please do that. Otherwise, you're going to order them direct from Amazon or from my publishers if you're trying to avoid big business like that. And I hope that's been an opportunity for you to be able to get some sight on that. And I'm going to shut up now, and I don't know whether it's Cynthia or, Cynthia, TJ, he's got Cynthia's name on his screen, would like to pick on anybody who would like to share a question, and I'll keep my eye on the online group as well. Have I shut down the PowerPoint now, TJ, so that everybody can see the online group as well as the in-present group?
Yeah, we do not see the PowerPoint. We see you and the gallery. First, can we get a round of applause for that person?
So my friends from Exeter are well used to of raising a digital hand or waving a hand, and if I see any hands being waved online, I'll comment on them. But why don't we start with you, TJ? Are there any hands in the room?
Do we have any questions in the room? I'm not seeing any.
Well, how about anybody online who wants to wave a hand? Or have I stunned you all into silence? I will admit I've just thrown a huge amount at you. Oh, last week you said try to give more time for questions, so I speeded up on the way through there so you could do that. No?
Oh, we have one question.
Robert, sir, you mentioned the Essenes. I've heard that the Essenes were saying things that actually predate the gospel, that they were sponsoring doctrines or issuing doctrines that anticipated some of what Jesus was to say. Is there any truth to that, or is that just an old shaggy?
Qumran, it's difficult to talk about the Essenes as a group because all we know really is the Qumran community. And that existed for several centuries before Jesus' time. Their primary commitment was to the Hebrew scriptures and copying them out, and this is what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when they realized that the Romans had got sufficiently fed up with the way the different Jewish groups were fighting one another, another bit in the life of Brian that's so accurate, the different popular fronts and so on, they rolled up their scrolls and put them into jars and hid them in a cave by the Dead Sea, which is what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are in two sorts. One are scrolls of books that we know as the Hebrew Scriptures. The prophets are like Isaiah and so on. They also had lots of their own writings. There is the community scroll. They were also expecting a messianic figure, a teacher of righteousness, and there's great debate about who that person was. There certainly are parallels with what John the Baptist says, and it looks quite likely that John the Baptist, who emerges from the desert, had been influenced by the Qumran movement, the Essenes. And of course, Jesus follows a lot of John the Baptist's teaching of the coming, the Essenes and John the Baptist, Jesus were all talking about the coming empire of God. So in that respect, there are a lot of parallels. In other ways, there are quite different, and the big difference is, of course, that the Essenes were essentially withdrawing from the world. And this is a thing that was down through Christian history as well. We cannot actually put this teaching into practice So the only people who can keep the teaching of Jesus and the New Testament are monks and nuns who take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience and withdraw from the world. And that's what they did. They withdrew into their community. It didn't help them any more than the zealots having swords helped them. The Romans just destroyed them all in the end, and they got fed up with a different thing, communication. But certainly the Essenes were following a kind of peaceful community, except their writings are vitriolic about the chief priests and the Sadducees who are compromising the faith in the temple. My John group people know that we spend quite a bit of time talking about John's attitude towards the rest of the Jews. That's nothing compared with what the Essenes have to say about the authorities in Jerusalem. Thank you for the question.
I have a question.
Yes, Dennis, online.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in anything that brings in Bonhoeffer. Lately, I'm finding Bonhoeffer's ethics are more apt than anything else for at least the discerning the times we're in presently. And I'm always wondering if things like even Braver Angels or some of the things that are trying to convene people of reds and blues together are even somewhat late to the party. So my question is are we discerning the times in a way that are we able to recognize when a usurpation and oppression reach a level where is it even possible to convene a group of people together where they aren't just listening to the signals that indicate whether you're a red or a blue,
Yeah.
and canceling everyone out from the beginning? Are we discerning enough to see
I think that's a very
how we might be arriving at those times?
it's a very important question, Dennis. Can I just check that people in the room and people online were able to hear Dennis's question? Do I need to repeat
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
You
we
all
can-
heard it. I think you're very astute, Dennis, and I totally agree with you. And I think we're in a very, very dangerous time. You obviously talk about it in Brave Rangers, red and blue, i.e. Democrat and Republican and so on. We have the same situation in England. We've just had elections of councils where the Reform Party, which came out of the UK Independence Party and Brexit, very strongly anti-immigration, very extreme right, won hundreds and hundreds of seats in the last 24, 48 hours, controlling large amounts of our local government now. We see how the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, again another right-wing nationalist group, or Marine Le Pen in France, and of course you've got Putin himself trying to resurrect some notion of holy Russia and so on. And you have a president at the moment here who, in the aftermath of Pope Francis' funeral, just declared that he would like to be Pope, and has just on the official White House site has just published a picture, an AI picture of himself in full papal robes, except it's not full papal. He's wearing a mitre, and he doesn't know enough about robes. He isn't wearing the robes that go with it. So I think we're at a very, very dangerous period.
Well, one thing.
So can I just say,
Yeah,
that's why I think you're absolutely right. And I think you're also asking the question that increasingly these groups will not listen to each other. If you do not listen, we will go the way of the societies that have consumed each other and so on. It's only if we can do a truth and reconciliation, it's only if you can do the Brave Angels and get people around a table and respect them and listen to those you disagree with. Otherwise, we're stuffed.
But one of the hallmarks of the present condition, I think, is we have to remember that, at least in this country, in corporations and in federal government, DEI initiatives and others, which have been such an enormous effort has been made to expunge those aggressively. Those were set up to do precisely the kind of thing that a Braver Angels program would be trying to do: get people to listen to and notice people that have been invisible to them, and systems of systematic orders of oppression that have been placed and invisible for them. And here we're in a situation where the power to convene those things is being systematically destroyed.
Well, that is typical, I'm afraid, of all oppressive regimes. I mean, the attack on the universities was one of the first things the Nazis did, one of the first things that was done in the Soviet Union, and now being done by Putin and so on. On Martin Luther King Day in Virginia Seminary, just before I came up to you, we had the black pastor of the Lutheran Reformed Church next door to the Capitol, the first black pastor they've had, giving the lecture in honor of Martin Luther King. And he put up the phrase, "We are made in the image of God." That is the Imago Dei, Dei. And of course, he put them in capital letters, DEI, for those who are watching online who don't know that's diversity, equality, and inclusion. And the idea that in order to be in the Imago Dei, you need to be in the Imago DEI, I thought was stunning. So that's why the Braver Angels initiative and things like that are so important.
Do we have any other questions? So I'm not seeing any hands on my end.
I'm also conscious that it's just turned noon in Chicago time, which is about your closing up time. So may I just say thank you very much for listening. I know was a gallop. I also know we were going through the method for the first time. Last week we looked at the method. Next week we'll be looking at beginning and end of life issues. We will be doing the same thing and looking at Jesus' teaching, the Gospels, Paul, and so on. The method is a bit confusing. Last week doing it in theory was difficult, which is why I tried to show it as an apartheid. We've been through it one. My experience of teaching this class over 6 weeks on other places is that each week you begin to get the method more clearly as we will move through life, sex, money, and so on. But I'm really grateful to you for your listening. Please do email me. My email is on the handout, which TJ will be sending around of these slides. And I went through it very quickly today. We couldn't look at all the references. If you want to follow it up, please look at the PDF. And TJ, I think you'll be putting up the recording in due course. And all I have to do, therefore, is to say thank you very much.
Thank you so much for